but his mother getting very upset. His father, who was a veteran of both World War I and World War II, an Army officer, getting more and more agitated and ready to head for the hills, no joke. I realized I'd gotten to a point where I was recognized in the work, so to say, in part simply because I was still doing it and hadn't died. Deductive reasoning tells me, number one, all my readings and hundreds of people I've spoken to over the years, some with backgrounds in government, I think when this phenomenon sprang on the scene in the summer of 1947, the forces that be were quite overwhelmed by what they were encountering. And we know as well as we can know that there were very powerful people in this government and other governments who felt the chances were that what we were seeing at that time were advanced technology from parts unknown, under intelligent control, and they weren't ours.
My Alien Life is recorded high atop the Northern Rocky Mountains and is heard all over the world, and you can listen everywhere fine podcasts are found. My website is www.myalienlifepodcast.com. There you'll find links to every episode, stories, photos, and much more. I am your host, Cameron Logan. This is My Alien Life, and the podcast starts right now.
My Alien Life Podcast.
Three, two, one, zero, and liftoff.
Peter Robbins is in the studio with his expert analysis and always great commentary that people like me rely on for integrity and experience. It's great to have you. Peter, thank you so much and welcome.
Well, I'm glad to be here, Cameron.
Yeah, good evening. I've gone to your website quite a few times over the last few months, and you put together a very nice read on the homepage, and I've gone there several times just to finish it, but it's about 3.5 years old. You were very, but it
is woefully out of date.
But not really. There's a lot of those things are pertinent today.
Yes, true.
At the time, were you very disappointed in the state of UFOlogy? Because there was some strong words there, but I think some necessary words nonetheless.
I was very disappointed in the corner that I had worked myself into, specifically around how disappointed I was with my former co-author of a book on the fairly well-known Rendlesham Forest UFO case from 1980 that happened in the UK. Somebody who I trusted and admired, who turned out to be a sociopath and a liar. And
I don't really know how to comment on that. That's very strong, but it is what it is. And but so over the years, I've come to take the information that you and I both get, or anybody gets, whether it be on the internet or TV or otherwise, sure. And usually with a grain of salt, because we've all been burned quite a few times. And what was your first clue? I mean, how would you even know? Because it's entirely subjective sometimes, and it's really hard to determine for me.
Well, again, we're talking about this one specific experience in my life, and it's completely separate from the authenticity of the event itself, minus his participation in it, as well as from UFOlogy itself. I'm basically a fairly trusting person. I'm a pragmatist. I check out my facts, although I certainly wasn't the investigative writer 30 years ago that I am now, and that's longer than that we began to work together. Also, in retrospect, I realized, to the best of my awareness, that I had never worked with anybody who intended to deceive me, and who at the same time was smart, charismatic, had woven quite an extraordinary web of lies, half-truths, exaggerations, and I bought it, where I completely turned the corner and devoted myself to the story and defended him for year after year, was on our very first trip over to the UK to begin our investigation of the events that he had allegedly been involved in. We had an extraordinary multiple UFO sighting not far from the perimeter of RAF Bentwaters and 5 or 6 miles from the site of the events that he alleged that he had been involved in. And it was one of the most memorable nights of my life. I'm not the kind of person who has many UFO-related sighting events in my life. And I was really quite blown away. And after 5 months of what I'll call the armchair phase of research, I realized, the guy is, I thought, PTSD'd. I don't believe that now. But I thought you either have to take his word for these things or not. Most everything he said seems to have checked out. So you're either going to work in partnership or you're not. And that's where I made my mistake. And I was able to go into denial around small contradictions where I simply should have dug deeper. And all through those years, I was one of those people quick to point out, always going back to one of the great mantras that confounds us in paranormal studies as well as other things. The forward text of the old X-Files paper, I want to believe, and criticizing other people for not checking things out deep enough and becoming believers rather than doing the investigations, when I had inadvertently become one of them. Where things began to unravel was years after the book came out. And it did okay here in the States, no better than, no worse than a lot of UFO books, but it was an absolute smash, top 10 bestseller in the United Kingdom. And for part of that summer, it was 2 points ahead of John le Carré's newest novel at that time, The Tailor of Panama, which I have to say was one of the great paranormal experiences of my life as a John le Carré fan. And we became quite well known and respected in the UK. I think I've been back there almost 25 times over the years. But after some years, people who had originally become known to me as fans, supporters, ultimately friends, started contacting me, all of them kind of grassroots investigators, all in the UK, saying, always respectfully, you really need to recheck what is noted that Larry allegedly had happened to him on page 87 or whatever, with what he said in this interview here, what he published here, what he said on this radio show. And my arrogance, I don't know what else to call it, was, please, little amateur person, I know the whole story better than you, and I'm sure it's the truth. Until they started to get back to me, not quite as polite, and said, you really need to look at. And there were quite a number of them, each one having chosen a piece of work. And at a certain point, I thought, oh, well, I'll read what these people have to say. And I was flabbergasted, Cameron. I absolutely was humbled, embarrassed, angry at myself. I spent the next year and a half or 2 years absolutely confirming the reality of their accounts, and then more and more contradictions in his statement, and his life and his business life started to come up. And I spent more than a year doing not much else professionally but apologizing to people. It's a very rough, depressing period, certainly the low point in my professional life. And I guess the irony for me was in simply taking responsibility and not trying to, put it off on anybody else. I came out of it overall with the same respect that I had previously, but now for kind of a different reason, and picked up and got back to work. And that's what I've been doing since.
So you're telling me you were in basically in an old-fashioned alien intervention where people came forward and tried to steer you in the right direction, though, which is nice in a way.
Yes, no aliens involved, all a human
well,
intervention.
An alien story intervention, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and I had really vaporized a number of important friendships over those years because I thought that they were deluded or misleading, or that I was right and they were wrong, and thankfully was able to restore most of those friendships, professional and otherwise, which means the world to me. The people that you make friends with in your life, especially doing your due diligence in this work, to me, mean more to me often than the work itself. I certainly could have written a number of extra books in the time that I dealt with coming out of this depression and staying in touch with friends and continuing on new projects, but that's the way I run my life, and I don't look back on that.
Yeah, and we could talk all night about narcissism, but some people, it doesn't do anybody else any good. I mean, the people who are the narcissists. But to me, it's so impressive that you did what you did and said what you said, because you could have potentially destroyed all your work if you did that wrong, or if you just decided to let sleeping dogs lie. Who knows how that would have turned out? But I don't know how you think it turned out, but I think it turned out well. And I love what I read because it was very concise and clear. And, you have a lot of believers in you as well as the event.
Well, I'm honored to have the people who follow my work and who take it seriously, and who I maintain cordial relationships and good friendships with, understanding that. It's the choice that I had was either to do what I did or to take, I don't know, a more typical tough guy kind of attitude of real men don't apologize. People will forget about it after a while. It'll be too embarrassing. I just want to get on. And that's not the way to be a professional, certainly not in this field where it's controversial enough. And, you take it on the chin. If you get it wrong, you correct the situation, do your best to move on, and somewhat more cautious as you do.
Well, you roll with the punches, and I get emails. Well, I know you do too. So you get emails all the time. You get audio recordings. Often I ask for those things, but the common denominator is not the story, or even though some are similar, but I always hear amazing intention, and I hear passion, and I hear a strong presence of emotion, and they always sound believable to me, and maybe most of them are, but it's easy to look beyond the story and see that passion and create something else in your mind that's there, the romantic part of ufology, and it's easy to fall into that, I think.
It's true. And I'm sure, well, I'm not sure, but I think anybody coming into the work, especially wide-eyed and fairly innocent and going through their own Pandora's boxes and having these series of revelations, it is very romantic. I got involved more than 40 years ago. It happened to me very quickly, and I didn't even know there was a thing called ufology. I didn't know that there was a field of study. It was something that had never interested me previously. And it was also, obviously pre-digital, pre-internet. The way that you learned was you read books, you wrote letters, you bought magazines and newspapers. Ultimately, you developed colleagues, networked through those colleagues, maybe after a while get an article published or attend a conference. It was a very different world back then. And now it's so overwhelming. You type in UFO or ufology or the name of any of the better known players, and you'll get a zillion hits, and you're overloaded with information. And, a good fake photograph back in the day, you could use a 10-power magnifying glass and see the edge of the paper cut where the UFO had been glued onto the sky, or with an ultraviolet light, see the string it was hanging from. Digital photography and, the world of visual imagery that we live in now changes everything. And it's makes me a bit wistful how many people immediately respond to an interesting image or piece of footage without any provenance whatsoever. No dates, no individuals, no witness testimony. It's just, gosh, that looks nice. And I want to believe that it's real. And wow, this is exciting stuff. Well, yes and no.
Yeah. What I miss is a good old hubcap on a string, because when I was a kid, that was it. And I never thought, when I was maybe 9 or 10 years old, I never thought anything of it. We weren't taking photos, but we were trying to just recreate something and what it would look like.
Yeah.
And for a lack of being able to see something that amazing in the sky on its own, so,
Yep.
But yeah, it's incredible now. Things have changed, and technology is changing faster than we are, and it's amazing what Just look at the Bernie Sanders memes that we're seeing today. I mean, if Bernie would have saw a UFO, it would have been a whole different thing. But it's pretty funny. But one thing that I was thinking about, and something that doesn't get mentioned, but Bud Hopkins mentions he listened to War of the Worlds back in 1938.
Yes.
And people don't bring that up. They talk about Roswell, and they talk about 1947, and there's a 9-year period there where UFOs were on people's minds. And what happened between 1938 and 1947, and why wasn't there a string of sightings back then and more news back then, do you think?
Well, several ways to look at that. And you probably have listeners that are not, they may have heard of this, but they're not really fully aware of what we're talking about.
Right.
In 1938, broadcast October 30th, the day before Halloween Eve, the Mercury Theater of the Air, a wonderful group of actors who worked as an ensemble company out of, I guess it was NBC Studios in Rockefeller Center, around the brilliant young producer Orson Welles, did a radio play version of the great H.G. Wells novel from about 1900 of War of the Worlds. It was written by a terrific, I was going to say screenwriter, but radio scriptwriter named Howard Fass. And Howard Americanized it, put it in Grover's Mills, New Jersey, as the famous story goes. He had a map of America up in his study, and when he got to the point of realizing he had to choose a name, he closed his eyes and he stuck out his finger, and it sat on a little town in New Jersey called Grover's Mills. And remembering that America was a more naive place at that time, we were much more isolationist, we were much more people in rural areas than concentrations in the city, much less sophisticated culture, and a culture that was really alarmed by the fact that only a month earlier, Europe had gone to war. They We weren't in it for another few years, but they were in a war, and it was bringing up all kinds of anxieties for the American people. And you can Google this and listen to it. By contemporary standards, it may seem very unsophisticated. I personally love those old-fashioned radio plays, and this one's a masterpiece. Bud Hopkins, basically one of the best-known UFO researchers, writers, investigators in the world, although we lost him in August of 2011. I had the honor of working as his assistant for many years. As a boy, as an 8-year-old, as I recall, he heard it through the wall of his bedroom. There's a radio in his parents' room next door. And he heard not just the radio play, but his mother getting very upset. His father, who was a veteran of both World War I and World War II, an Army officer, getting more and more agitated and ready to head for the hills, no joke. But if you listen to it with a contemporary mind, you realize that they're cutting away from commercials, and they're taking weeks and compressing it into whatever it was, 40 minutes or something.
Right.
And it was so believable to that audience that at those breaks, they went to their phones. And phone systems around the country crashed because people on Manhattan were rushing to the Hudson River to see New Jersey in flames. And at the end of the show, Orson, I hope you don't mind my going off on this tangent.
It's a good story.
It's fascinating.
It is.
At the end of the show, Wells comes on as himself and just says, we wanted to, wish you in our own way a happy Halloween and say boo, goes home and has no idea of what's happening around the country. Gets called early in the morning, has to come into NBC, and you see photographs of him, and he's in shock, unshaven, and, banks of reporters. It caused a scandal. Shortly thereafter, he and the Mercury Theater of the Air, many of whom went on to become very well-known screen actors, headed for Hollywood. And a few years later, some of them, along with Wells as their leader, produced one of the finest films ever made in this country, Citizen Kane. But it reverberated. The story reverberated. The fear of panic. I'm trying to remember when it was, but a sociological scholar at Princeton, I believe it was sociology, named Hadley Cantrell, Cantrll, wrote a book called either The War of the Worlds or The Attack from Mars, a study in the mass psychology of panic. And it's fascinating. Well, my point being, with that long backstory, that major activity from unknown objects, from points on unverified, unknown at this point, in many cases still, might not have begun in earnest until the summer of 1947. Also, once the whole War of the Worlds radio show thing became public knowledge, everybody knew it was a fantasy. Everybody knew it was a radio play. And so they weren't looking to the skies, and there probably was not. If there was activity, there was some activity, and certain UFO scholars have done a great job of documenting it, but the so-called modern age of UFOs began in earnest in the summer of 1947. However, we see references, especially in early documents from the 40s, fully gilt-edged, legally declassified, some of them even before the Freedom of Information Act, where agencies, offices within the government are referring to the fear of panic as elicited by, the Mercury Theater of the Air, blah, blah, blah. And it is a fair arguing point that still has some validity. But I think it's just one of the most fascinating episodes in that mechanical kind of concern that emerged and fed the early secrecy establishment in part. You can't tell the people, as my dear departed friend Georgina Bruni named her book about the Rendlesham Forest incident, which is a direct quotation from Margaret Thatcher relative to this subject. And Georgina knew that for a fact because she said it to her, but that's another story.
But I think, it took a while. 1938 came and went. And then, now, of course, if that would have happened, you would see copycat sightings and hear about them and read them. But it seemed to be a lull after that. I don't know if it scared so many people that they kind of shied away from the subject, but I would have expected to read more about, that time period, that 9 years after that, people would have been seeing all kinds of lights in the sky, but, it was a different time then too.
Yeah, I think from my studies over the decades that there genuinely were only a handful of truly questionable so-called UFO sightings in that period of 8 or 9 years. That, again, the phenomena did not fully reveal itself or, hit the road, with all tires spinning until the summer of 1947. And again, once the story was out, everybody knew that it wasn't real. It was a story. It was a radio play. It wasn't like, I'm going to start looking at the skies because there was a radio play, and now I'm thinking maybe they're real. It's a little counterintuitive. But again, the skies became full of them, real ones in no uncertain terms, real being truly anomalous, in the summer of 47. So that doesn't surprise me that there was, so to say, that lull between that legendary radio broadcast and the summer of Roswell.
I know everyone would like to tell you their story. I mean, where do you draw the line? I know that there's only so much time in life, and in your day is got to be pretty full already.
Yeah.
How do you separate the two?
Well, despite the experience that I discussed earlier, I find that the incidents of fabrications, of people intentionally going out of their way to deceive you, to want to fool you, to want to make you look foolish, to scam you in some sense, are extremely rare. And I'm a public figure in this work. It would be impolite of me to, dismiss anybody that comes up to me at a conference or who sends me an email or a note on Facebook or a message in comments on my weekly radio show to say, I'm a really busy guy. I can't answer your question. I do my best. And I've interviewed so many people over the decades, and just working with Bud, had privy to several hundred other in-depth investigations. You do your best to be there as a good listener. Use your common sense, your critical thinking, deductive reasoning to make a character judgment. And, if they're looking for a professional to speak with because they've had an experience, say, and they want to pursue it with some kind of mental health professional or hypnotherapist or an historian, or they'd like to be able to write about it and want, ask you some basic questions about writing and publishing. I just figure that's part of my job as a human being at this point in my life, to be available. And at certain times I just can't get back to everybody, but I do my best to actually try to.
Good. Talk about as we frame and could frame Bud Hopkins as a mentor, what were the most important elements that he brought to ufology? And when he passed, what was taken away that we'll never get back, do you think, in your opinion?
Yeah. Well, let me put it this way. My first guest on the radio show that I'm doing now, called Meanwhile Here on Earth, was Kathleen Marden, who is somebody really all of us in the field look up to. Kathleen is arguably the most knowledgeable, or certainly one of a handful of the most knowledgeable people alive on the so-called UFO abduction phenomena. And her interest in the subject was not intellectual per se. She is the niece of Betty and Barney Hill, whose experience in the early 1960s became the first really well-known incident. And I had asked her at one point, what is good background for somebody who wants to do what we do? And Kathleen, who has a background in education and psychology, cited those two fields, science, of course. And I agree with her. But anybody with a genuine interest who is serious about the subject can take what they have and pursue it. Bud was and remained a painter his whole life, a professional artist painter. We had that in common, although I had gotten out of the field by the time I really started to work in this field. But art is still a big part of my life. And when you are a trained artist, and I am a proud graduate of New York School of Visual Arts, where I was also on faculty for a dozen years as a painting instructor, you learn to approach life and certain problems out of the box, so to say. And once Bud's curiosity was fired up about this subject through an account that a neighbor, a business person in the neighborhood who we knew told him, which was the story that launched Bud's career, he trained himself to be as fine an investigator as if he had, graduated from some detective school. I used to joke with him that if he had gone into law enforcement, there'd be a lot more people in New York State in prison. He was a brilliant investigative writer. He was also a pragmatist, and although grounded in the arts, a realist, somebody who worked with a center around the Western philosophies rather than anything mystical. He followed up on every detail. He networked with so many professionals over the years. I was beginning to do that when we met, but the example he set for me only reinforced that behavior for me. My other two early mentors, one was a tough, no-nonsense New York City police detective who also happened to be a very serious and a very good UFO investigator. And the other, who I met well into his 70s, had been a staff officer in the Royal Hungarian Army in charge of photo analysis, photo reconnaissance. And he became involved in the subject early on after he had emigrated to the States in 1952 or 3, when the Washington, D.C. overflights happened. And as, at that point, one of the world's most respected photo analysts, the photos that were taken, backed up by thousands of witnesses who saw these things, that got him into the work. And Coleman, the former staff officer, was a very serious Catholic and always went to church on Sunday, but he considered himself a military scientist and felt that you don't mix your religious beliefs with the scientific study of UFOs. Well, that was his philosophy. I take it very seriously as well. I approach it in a very nuts and bolts manner, like Bud did. And it was one of the great privileges of my life, and also one of the most fascinating and often exciting things that I've ever been involved in. And again, because of Bud, I had the opportunity to be the bug on the wall, or, the observer, or the secondary participant in several hundred separate abduction-related investigations, more than 800 that Bud did in his life, but several hundred that I actively assisted on.
I know in other disciplines there is data being saved because technologically we aren't there yet. We don't know how to decipher it. We don't know how to examine it properly.
Yeah.
So there's storage for those kinds of databases. But I think, what you're talking about, there's a paradigm here that could be followed for the sake of a way to pursue something as close to truth as we can get right now.
Yes, I agree. And if you keep out of your own way and you do enough work and immerse yourself in it, I know for me, X number of years ago, I realized I'd gotten to a point where I was recognized in the work, so to say, in part simply because I was still doing it and hadn't died, which helps. But it was one of those, sort of 15-watt bulb moments in your life where you have a minor epiphany. And it was, I absolutely knew for a fact how little I really knew.
Right.
So much of it is what you want to believe, what you're afraid of believing, what you think is true, what you want to be true, what you hope is true, what you fear is true. And I do occasionally drive people a little to distraction because I'm almost pathological about separating what I know and could prove in a court of law, what I know for a fact but can't quite prove in a court of law, what I think is the case, but here's the evidence and the proofs that I have. I don't think it's enough to prove my case, but I think it sets the basis. Here's what I don't believe. This is what I parse everything in that sense. And it does irritate me when I hear somebody in the work say, not, this is what I know to be true. This is what I have deduced after many years of study. This is my personal belief, as opposed to this is, and then spouting off some alleged fact about other intelligences from points unknown with specific calculations or numbers or distances that there's no way they could actually know, even if they have contacts, at the head of the NSA and the supreme leaders of 12 alien races and the president of the United States, et cetera, et cetera. And because this is a totally unregulated field, to put it mildly, it's not like, we're a doctor and the AMA is going to yank our license if we're caught fabricating, something, or an attorney in our local bar association is going to strip us of our ability to practice law. If you want to be a ufologist, I believe the protocol, or one of them, is you touch your finger to your nose, you turn around 3 times, and you say, I'm a ufologist, and you are. And there is no, if you're a MUFON investigator and you have trained in that methodology and you're caught fabricating case information, okay. That's a large organization. If you're exposed, they could drop you from the organization and tell people, to watch out for you because you are an unethical person. So again, even if you had $1 million, a research grant, your best tools are still going to be in the realm of your common sense, your critical thinking, and deductive reasoning. Sometimes that's all it comes down to. Again, if you have an array of telescopes and you're watching a fully articulated craft come in from deep space, that's something else again. Or if you do have an associate deep within the intelligence community and you trust the paperwork that you're getting, well, maybe there too. But I wouldn't, you have to be very cautious in all of your investigations. Again, with the internet, it's such a double-edged sword. If we were on camera right now, you'd see behind me a fairly substantial library of hundreds of books, many of which are devoted to the UFO subject, and others go off on the tangents of history, astronomy, science, political science, things that I've educated myself to over the years, because these are credible sources that have withstood the test of time, that, have not been caught up in fantasy They're written by authors who, lived a life where they were respected and no scandal was shown kind of thing. It's very analog. But if you're doing all your research online, be careful. Be careful.
Exactly. Good advice. All good advice. And it's not rare to hear someone call themselves an expert. We hear amateur astronomer, amateur paleontologist, biologist, whatever, but that's acceptable. You could read those opinions in tomorrow's paper where they quote an amateur whatever. You hear that every day.
Yep. And we're all amateur until we become professional. People say, how do you write a book? I say, well, you just start writing.
Right.
No author was an author before they started writing. No painter was a painter before they started painting. If you're intent on doing something, get started on it. Granted, your early results may not be what you are hoping for, but the more you do, the more comfortable you get, the better you are at your game. And at a certain point, you have a contribution to make, and you can do it in a way that other people will come to respect.
Yeah, definitely. Wow, I was thinking about this today, and I really am getting burned out on disclosure, but is there a real cover up by the U.S. government, or are they just as baffled as we are?
Well, they don't tell me personally.
Exactly.
But deductive reasoning tells me, number one, all my readings and the hundreds and hundreds of people I've spoken to over the years, some with backgrounds in government, I think when this phenomena sprang on the scene in the summer of 1947, the forces that be were quite overwhelmed by what they were encountering. And we know as well as we can know that there were very powerful people in this government and other governments who felt the chances were that what we were seeing at that time were advanced technology from parts unknown, under intelligent control, and they weren't ours. It's difficult for many people to kind of time travel in their mind back to that moment where World War II had just ended. America was what we wish we were now in many cases. We were an heroic nation of overall extremely decent people, many of whom had sacrificed their lives to help destroy fascism in Europe, and doing something I don't think anybody had ever done really in the history. Well, that's not fair to say, but our two biggest enemies, the Japanese and the Germans, we didn't go in there and murder everybody or make them live subservient, humiliating lives. We helped them not just rebuild their nations, but to develop moral philosophies and constitutions. Look at the world right now. What was the last war that Japan or Germany started? I grew up in an American Jewish family, and I became aware of Nazism in my adolescence and learned about it. But I don't think there is a more decent country in many respects than Germany in terms of having institutionalized fairness, seeing discrimination, seeing racism, seeing anti-Semitism as something so basically wrong that it is unconstitutional to behave in that manner. People can complain about, well, they have a right to do whatever they want to do. Well, yes and no. But at that time, the men, because it was men running the government, period, they were riding high. We knew we had another enemy right there on the horizon, and it's interesting to remember that the summer of 1947 was right when the Cold War was named and codified. And we knew that, the Russians, who we were allied with because we had the same enemy during World War II, were our next big enemy, and that this could be nuclear. I think the idea of admitting to the American people that not only we may not be alone in the universe, but there are machines coming and going out of our skies that we can't touch. Their technology is completely beyond us. Why they're here, we don't know. And Truman, who was a tough son of a gun, and very much a man of the people in many respects, I think if it had been left completely to him, after 6 months or so of studying, he would have just gone on the air and said, my fellow Americans, this is the way it is. But that circle of advisors, and I am convinced, whatever else it became or didn't become, that there was a working group with 12 of the most powerful and intelligent and knowledgeable men in their areas of study who advised him that they weren't ready, and they certainly did not want to relinquish the incredibly thin air, the excitement, the being in the inner circle of the inner circle of being the top secret keepers in the world at the time, probably advised him we need to keep studying this. And that cover-up upon the cover-up upon the cover-up, think of it as a piece of sand inside of an oyster that gets calcified and becomes a pearl. At the center of the national security state that America is, that little piece of sand isn't about, preserving our nuclear secrets. It's about hiding the fact that we knew this was up in the summer of 1947. And an amazingly effective effort was mounted in the media to convince the American people that not only was there nothing to it, but that you were, you should be made fun of if you took this seriously. The classic little green men in flying saucers. That understood, Cameron, I think over the time between then and now, it's been slowly unraveling. For decades, it certainly held. And the American people accepted that, as did the Western world, so to say. But in more recent years, more and more people have become more and more interested in the subject. And in the last 3 years or so, it has really opened up tremendously. And with that opening, the historic ridicule factor has begun to really wither on the vine, which is a huge change a huge sea change. Up until late 2017 or so, the media en masse overall, with exceptions here and there, didn't take the subject seriously or seriously enough. And the official government position was, we're not going to comment at best, or what you saw was explainable in some conventional term. And now, I think if it had not been for the pandemic and our attention appropriately being on this crisis that we're all right smack in the middle of right now, unfortunately, last year really was a banner year for official recognition by various service branches, by aspects of official science, by major players in the media, that this is real. And let me put it this way, more and more people now care less and less what other people think about what they think about truly anomalous UFOs and their implications for humanity.
When people see a UFO now, to the best of your knowledge, and every case is different, but I'm just wondering, are there people out there that still call the Air Force, local law enforcement, try to get everybody involved as quickly as possible? Does that happen anymore, or do they keep it to themselves and contact MUFON or another?
Yeah. The late, great Stanton T. Friedman, for any listeners not aware of that name, a nuclear physicist and then retired nuclear physicist who spent really the lion's share of his career.
And skeptic.
Well, he was
in ways
a proponent of the reality of truly anomalous UFOs. But yes, he was not a believer as much as somebody who established and reestablished it in scientific terms.
I guess what I wanted, I'm sorry, I don't mean to butt in, but objective is what I want to say, not skeptic.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things that he had observed over the years was for governments, the prize was cracking the technology, which I believe to a degree we have, but cracking it in terms of weaponizing it. If we could weaponize this advanced technology, and again, arguably, in some ways, perhaps we have or are on our way to, we could be, the biggest kid on the block with the biggest baseball bat. And unfortunately, we still live in a world built very strongly on mistrust and the other, and the kind of Neolithic idea that if you cross this line in the dirt, I'm going to have to kill your butt because you're on my side of the line and you should be on your side of the line. This is how far we've advanced. Unfortunately, this is the way it is still to a degree. And I actually have completely lost the thread of what your question was.
Well, I just what I was asking is back in the day, and of course, 1947 to up until through the 70s and 80s, somebody saw a UFO. They were contacting the Air Force and local law enforcement. Everybody, the local radio station.
Absolutely. I think it's a very mixed bag. In 1968, the Air Force made a very public display of getting out of the UFO business, which of course they did not. But they no longer routinely accepted reports. Although, again, just behind the curtain, they were very curious and involved in collecting information and doing their studies and the like. Law enforcement, local law enforcement, especially in more rural regions, they still get calls. But there are a number of UFO-related hotlines. You do have MUFON, which, although it only has X number of thousands of members, is still the largest UFO organization in the world. There are other organizations, and many of them absolutely terrific. There are now more public groups, so to say. You can simply go online and say, Google, where do I report a UFO? And find like-minded souls who will take you seriously, take your report, etc. But the internet changed everything, I think, in part, Cameron, and that sort of analog reality of calling the police or calling your local Air Force base has become a bit arcane in the past years as far as reporting go. The point about Stan that I was going to say, he lectured over 600 universities and colleges in his career, which is nobody's going to come close to that. And one of the questions that he always asked at the beginning of his talk, you've got an audience of younger people there. How many people have seen a UFO? Hands go up. He'll do an informal count. Very good, thank you. How many of you reported the UFO that you saw? And overall, statistically, 1 in 10 hands went back up. So 90% of those people didn't report it. And you don't have to be a mental health professional to understand why. Fear of ridicule governed it almost exclusively up until the last few years, when that has dissipated some. So there was that historic reticence. I'm trying to address it now in my own way, in that after all these years as a writer, a researcher, an investigator, an activist, a public speaker, an author, I'm now not even a podcast. I'm doing a regular old-fashioned 2-hour live radio show every week on a station called KGRA. And when they invited me to take the job, I thought about it for months. They were kindly held it open for me. But I realized if I'm going to be doing what so many colleagues, people I know and really admire, care about, some of them good friends, others esteemed colleagues, are doing, why bother? And I thought, I need to find a way to not just build the audience of people that listen to shows like yours, or, at the other extreme, coast to coast. I want to find a way to reach people who have never really been interested in listening to a UFO or paranormal related radio show or podcast. And I'm doing just that week by week now, and trying to create programming that will appeal to the most seasoned veteran of the subject, but in no way intimidate a first timer. I think for people like me, maybe for you, but for the field itself, one of the things that we need to do more and more consciously is not spend so much time talking to each other, and find ways to reach out into that much larger audience of people, many of whom are ready to start learning about this. But, you tune in a show that's so hyper specialized, and there's some expert talking, and you don't know who it is, and you have no idea what their research is about. I'm building actually on a series of biographical interview conversations. We know who this person is, but how did they become that person? And in so many words, learning the life stories of people in the work. And I think giving those of us who think that we knew them an opportunity to see how they became that person that we thought we knew, and folks who are just getting involved an opportunity to meet the human being first. And at the end of 2 hours, hopefully say, I'm intrigued. This is a person I can relate to. They've been through things. I respect their journey. I'd like to read one of their books, or I'd like to hear them at a conference when there's such a thing as UFO conferences again, or. But we need to build our audience. We need to involve more and more people, because you mentioned earlier disclosure. It ain't going to happen by a official release of, from the President of the United States. I just don't believe that's going to be the case. There are a number of scenarios that we can make our best educated guesses at, but whatever it is, we're going to need a critical mass of individuals within a population, nationally and internationally, a tipping point. I say this as somebody who worked for years as an off-Broadway theater manager, and in a state-of-the-art 210-person theater, if you're doing a revival of a great comedy and it's close to packed, people will roar. If it's a rainy Thursday night and you've only got half your seats filled, people will be more self-conscious about laughing out loud, if you know what I mean. There needs to be a group kind of zeitgeist. And the more people in the general population that start learning about the subject at hand, that start taking it more seriously, are setting the stage for disclosure per se to become a reality sooner than later, I believe.
One of the things I see too that's happening is we definitely have a different way of communicating now, and there's so many ways to communicate, but I feel it's not as effective as it used to be, because people aren't actually getting together, having conversations where the story all of a sudden switches and somebody saw a UFO or somebody had an experience. I mean, verbally, they're not exchanging these stories like it used to happen. And I realize that people go online and they read about this. And I know many people that know me know I have a podcast, but they aren't aware that this kind of stuff happens, and
Yes.
or not aware of the magnitude that it happens. So they just kind of sit idly by and don't even think to ask. And there's questions out there they don't even think about.
I think that it's a very good observation, and sadly, it's being driven even more so in this extraordinary time that we are all living through. There is no substitute for real human contact. And one of the things I love about the conference circuit is that you can spend a couple of days with a group of people, or up to a week if it's a big major international conference, and be approached, go up to other people, hear discussions, hear presentations, see alleged proof put forward, stay up late at night, talking at the bar with people, and really engage in dialogue. The tragedy of advanced communications technology for me, as someone who grew up in an earlier time, is I've met a lot of people who were considerably younger than me, who are smart as whips, who are successful at what they do, who, they've got everything going for them, except they don't know how to carry on a communication, and their lives is caught up in their handheld devices and staring into the palms of their hands, and a word or two here and there to an actual living person. But I think it's tragic in a way, in a nostalgic way, as somebody that is proud of their penmanship, a word that has disappeared from the lexicon, that younger people aren't even taught to write in script anymore. That if you're a scholar a couple of generations from now and you're looking at the manuscript of a great book, it'll simply be a printout from a computer and not something that was labored over, at least in part, by hand. Or reading an actual book. Unfortunately, more and more people read less and less for pleasure and read less and less in general. And when they do read, they're reading on some kind of iReader, which is great. I think they're brilliant machines. The fact that you can walk around with something the size of an old-fashioned school notebook that has 1,100 books on it, that for me is quite extraordinary. And again, I'm old school. I love having a library, a real library of all kinds of books that I've spent my life putting together. And the same way that I like listening to records, as well as, broadcasts and, other ways of storing musical information. I think a lot of it is generational, but that human communication aspect, the internet has short-circuited a lot of the pleasure and the importance of actual conversation. One of the things that made Stanton Friedman such a great communicator, and you can just go, if you're not familiar with him, just Google his name and listen to part of one of his lectures. In high school, he was a debater, and he knew how to argue a point. For a lot of people, they simply don't. The idea of engaging in an actual face-to-face conversation where you take one point of view and the other person takes another point of view is almost hard to imagine. And sadly, in this internet age, too many people hide behind identities that, to be kind, are not fully authentic, and say things that they would never say if they were face-to-face with the person. And that's kind of a casualty of our modern age.
I have another podcast, and we talk about the arts as a story and stress that every artist has a story to tell other than just their art.
Yes.
And,
yeah.
It's the what shaped them and how they became what they are. And I believe that that's definitely true to every soul out there, that they have a budding artist inside of them, and as a way to make it come out. Who knows how to do that? And we're losing that part too. The creativity, it's getting lost in the handheld device, but I'm guilty of it too, Peter.
Well, it's a very poignant observation. The good news is that just understanding that simple fact can give you potentially an opportunity to face it and say, you know what? I'm going to start keeping a notebook. I'm going to start journaling. I'm going to write a short story. Even if I never show it to anybody, I'm going to get a pad and start sketching. I don't want to show anybody my drawings because they're not very good. But maybe if I keep drawing, I'll do better drawings. I'll enjoy it more. You know what? Maybe I'll start showing them to people I care about. Everybody now walks around pretty much with a high quality camera.
Right.
I think there's almost nothing sadder than seeing that classic image of a really attractive young woman staring into her iPhone, looking gravely serious. It's as opposed to photographing the world around you rather than getting lost in the narcissist culture of here I am again with me. And aren't I something? Look, here I am in another place. Oh, look, here I am in another place, rather than those of us who love photography and who have pictures of ourselves, but mostly have pictures of the places that we have been and the things that we've done, not necessarily with us in the frame.
Right. Tonight we have 1 million people creating Bernie Sanders memes right now. So that's a step in the right direction, though. I mean, they're very funny, they're very creative right now. But
I wonder if he regrets wearing that coat and mittens. It was an inauguration. He could have dressed up a little.
Right. By the way, my first concert ever was in 1981 in Canada. I saw Blue Oyster Cult.
All right.
Yeah.
Way to go.
Yeah, that was the Godzilla tour, I believe, and it was incredible.
Oh my gosh.
So it kind of shaped me as far as what my entertainment was going to look like for the next decades. But
well, that is so funny. As you know, my long history with that wonderful band going back to, believe it or not, before they were the Blue Oyster Cult. And if I step out of my office here, I have 5 gold and platinum records up on my wall, all for Blue Oyster Cult albums. 3 of them my sisters, my late sister Helen, who was a lyricist for them, and 2 of them for me, for art direction on Agents of Fortune.
Right.
And in fact, if you tune in my radio show, it begins and goes out with a theme song and a wonderful voiceover by the great Race Hobbs, one of the great voices in radio. But the theme song was written for me by my soul brother, Albert Bouchard, founding member of the Blue Oyster Cult and their original drummer.
Very cool. Yeah, I got to actually, they had regular small tours in the, it was the late 80s, but I got to see them a couple more times. So, but
totally cool.
Yeah.
A wonderful band.
At their peak, and for the very first one ever. But give a little plug really quick. I know you just mentioned it, but your radio show, talk about that real quick, where people can hear it. And what do you talk about?
Well, I'm only on Monday. I'll be doing my very 5th show, so I'm hardly a veteran. The first show was just me talking about what I intended to do with the radio show, and the 3 shows that have followed have been in-depth biographical interviews. The first with Kathleen Marden, one of our world's leading abduction researchers. The second with Robert Salas, one of the great rational voices in UFO studies, who, as a young Army officer or Air Force officer, was involved in a extraordinary nuclear UFO event, in that he was in charge of 10 Minuteman ICBMs, nuclear tipped, that UFOs, disc-shaped objects coming in over the base, completely took offline. And last week, this past Monday, my guest was Robbie Graham, arguably our greatest UFO-related film scholar. And on Monday, my guest will be an old friend and somebody I love and admire to the moon and back, Deb White Cabell, who was the central figure in Bud Hopkins' internationally best-selling book Intruders, which was made into a CBS miniseries some years after that. And the show is called Meanwhile Here on Earth. You can listen to it live on KGRA radio, It is 7 to 9 Eastern Standard Time, and you can get there by going to their website, KGRADB for digital broadcasting, KGRADB.com. Takes page, click at the top where it says Listen Live, and takes you to another page. Click on the play button, and the show starts about 7.
Peter Robbins has been my guest tonight. He's an investigative writer, author, and lecturer whose writing and research are focused on the subject of truly anomalous UFOs and their implications for humanity. Excellent show, Peter. Thank you so much.
Cameron, my pleasure. Keep doing the good work you're doing.
We will. Good night, sir.
Good night.
You can find my website at www.myalienlifepodcast.com, and please subscribe to my latest downloads at iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and at podbean.com. And please follow me and like me on Facebook and Twitter. My Alien Life is written and produced for broadcast at Studio 254 in the Northern Rocky Mountains. The music you are hearing is produced and created by Elion. You can find all Elion's work online at Heart Dance Records.